This is Grandmaster Daniel Narditsky. We are watching Valentina Gunina taking on Wenjun, the women's world champion, at the 2023 World Blitz Championship in Uzbekistan. And the players starting off with a pretty conventional opening, a Queen's Gambit decline, and now a semi-Tarrasch as Wenjun brings her C-pawn up to the center. And a big exchange in the center. This is a very, very popular opening. Black takes on d4 and then takes on d5 and now gets an isolated queen pawn on d5. And Valentina brings her pawn up to e3. And very likely, Black's knight is going to jump up to c6 and chase that white queen away from d4. But once it leaves d4, that rook on d1, which has just arrived to its ideal square, it's going to exert tremendous pressure on the d5 pawn. And so in this very interesting but rather dubious opening, the battle often revolves around White's ability to win the d5 pawn, and Black is going to play around it. Black is going to create pressure on other parts of the board, as you see from Queen b6, which is an excellent attacking move. The b2 pawn is under fire, and White's queen on a4, it can defend it from c2, but that would involve making another move with the white queen, and Valentina has paused here for very good reason. That pawn on b2, it needs to be defended, but it's not entirely clear what the best way to protect it is. And bishop to b5, that looked like a very long move by Gunina. She brings her bishop up, developing a piece, preparing to castle kingside, but also intercepting Black's attack of the b2 pawn. And now a6 is the kind of obvious response, and it would very likely trigger an exchange on c6, and Wenjun very likely trying to decide who that exchange is going to favor. And she doesn't seem too happy by this turn of events. That bishop b5 move might have been overlooked as the queen escapade to b6. It looked very, very strong, but now that queen on b6 is kind of shut down by that bishop. And we will see if a6 is her response, and it is. a6 is on the board. That bishop on b5, it's technically not really hanging, but wow, bishop back to d3. And I'm surprised by this move. The bishop drops back to d3. Valentina, she does not want to give up her bishop pair, and instead she gives up the b2 pawn. And why can't the black queen just help itself to that b2 pawn? Maybe the reason is something like bishop takes f6 followed by knight takes d5. Maybe Valentina thinks that she could somehow keep that queen in her clutches, but we're about to find out, because queen takes b2 has been played, and indeed bishop takes f6 triggers an exchange of the bishops, and now the knight gobbles up that isolated d5 pawn. So material, it's still equal. The b2 pawn was captured, the d5 pawn was captured, but now the position is anything but. It's a very unbalanced position. That bishop from f6, it can deliver a check on c3, but the main thing to watch out for here for Wenjun is that queen on b2, which might very well get trapped. In fact, Yes, I think White is threatening the move rook to b1, rook d1 to b1, a very unassuming move. But that queen is just going to be trapped, and it's very hard to guarantee a square for the black queen. And Wenjun now down to a minute. She could try the move b5. She could try to dislodge the white queen, but the white queen is just going to slide over to e4. And then mate will be threatened on h7, and the c6 knight will have lost its support. And I don't really see a good move here. She might have to sacrifice her queen for a rook and a piece, and she can do that with a move bishop to e6. Bishop to e6 would be kind of an emergency option. Bishop e6, rook b1, and then you could capture the rook on b1 and capture the knight on d5, and you would have a rook and a bishop for the white's queen. But obviously that is not an ideal outcome. And Black's position looks so nice. That queen on b2, that bishop on f6 can jump into c3 with a check. And yet, Wenjun still hasn't found a move, and she's got 30 seconds on her clock. The women's world champion has to make a decision, and more hesitation there. She's under 30 seconds, and finally, knight to e7 is her decision. And indeed, I think she is preparing to sacrifice her queen on b1 and then take on d5. And I actually don't think that Black's position in that resulting battle is going to be all that bad. Black is going to have the bishop pair. Black is going to have a lot of queenside control, as well as a queenside majority. Bishop to c3 check is thrown in by Wenjun. So she throws in that check, but what does it really change? I think she still is going to have to sacrifice her queen on b1 and then take on d5. And watch out, because White's queen could slide over to e4, and that almost picks off another minor piece. But fortunately for Black, she's got the move knight to f6. She's got the move knight to f6, jumping back, defending h7. Valentina Gunina, she seems very confident here in her position. Can she go after Black's minor pieces? No, she goes after Black's king. Knight to g5. What a scary move to deal with when you've got only 20 seconds on your clock. And Wenjun, You can sense the anxiety there. H6, chasing the knight away, and queen to e4. As tempting of a move as it is, it's actually not a good one because the knight jumps back to f6 and the h7 square is going to be controlled. And so instead, Gunina drops her knight back to e4 and the bishop on c3 is under fire. And Wenjun has to keep that bishop pair. That is one of the sources of her compensation, but she's got 13 seconds on her clock in this punishingly difficult, complex position. She's worse. She definitely doesn't have quite enough for the queen, but she's trying to remedy that as the rook comes to c8, the bishops come to e6, and I think Wenjun is actually doing a great job of consolidating her position and gaining some compensation. And what a move! Rook to c4. Rook to c4 is an incredible tactic. That rook is untouchable because of knight takes e3 check, and that queen would have been recovered. And so Gunina drops her queen back to d1, and with only 4 seconds on the clock, b5 by the women's world champion, the queen cycles around to h5. Okay, now the rook comes into d1, and now it's Gunina's turn to launch an offensive and chase the black pieces out of the center. Knight to e7. Wenjun has to oblige. And are there tactics? No. Back to home base goes the white queen. Bishop to d5, pinning the knight, forcing the weakening move. f3, Wenjun is playing an amazing game with only a couple of seconds on her clock. She's doing a terrific job of sort of keeping the status quo and continuing to induce weaknesses in white's position. But she is still down a queen, and white is still pressuring the king side. Bishop to a7. Gunina has plenty of time on her clock. Queen to d3 was another devilish move. It threatened 2 checkmates on h7, and actually there was a mate on d8 that was threatened, and so Wenjun has to make some luft, but g6 is a very weakening move in 4 seconds as that knight, it couldn't decide where to go. Knight to c6, knight to e4. Gunina brings her knight into the game. 2 seconds for Wenjun. Rook to d8, chasing the white queen away. Oh, but that's a pin. That rook on d1 is undefended. Oh, Gunina blundered that move. Gunina blundered rook to d8, and now the white queen has nowhere to go. She might have to sacrifice the queen back. Oh, but that endgame is going to be really bad news for white because while the e3 pawn is weak, the a2 pawn is weak, and that black rook on c4 can infiltrate down to c1 or to the side down to a4. Gunina blundered rook to e8, and with only 3 seconds, the women's world champion was able to spot that the rook on d1 is undefended, and I don't see a different move for white. She might have to play queen takes rook, or maybe queen takes knight is a better version of that sacrifice. No, she's going to move back to f4. Gunina is going to keep her queen at all costs. Oh, with 2 seconds left, Wenjun just didn't have the time to capture white's rook on d1, and instead she went g5. She allowed a check. She allowed a trade. Oh, white's going to win. Queen d6 check. What a move. King g7. Another check on h5. That's forced mate. That's forced mate. Knight h5 is mate in 2. Knight h5 is mate in 2 moves, and she finds it. And Wenjun stops the clock and graciously extends her hand. She almost came all the way back, down a queen, but just didn't quite have enough time to deliver the final blow. All credit to Valentina Gunina for keeping pressure on the board and on the clock. What a game. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.